So welcome back to the Semi-Americans podcast. Today we have the privilege of bringing on Katya Davydova, who is a former high school classmate of ours. And she joins us today to discuss her newly published work, a book titled A Joy in Plain Sight, available at Amazon, Barnes & Nobles, as well as Kindle for those of you who prefer reading online. So please join us in welcoming Katya.
Thank y'all. Thank y'all so much, Emmanuel and Daniel. It is just such an incredible opportunity to connect with you 12 years after we honestly recently touched base. And what a joy to share this space with y'all. So thank you so much for having me on.
Of course, the pleasure's all ours. I was really excited when we got to connect, and I'm really looking forward to that. So, there's a lot of things that you discuss in your book. But before we get into all of that, obviously, we want the audience to know who you are and ask you a few questions about your background, your upbringing, and things of that nature.
Perfect. Sounds good. Let's dive in.
All right. So I have to ask this question to every guest that we have. Do you, Katya, feel like a semi-American?
The short answer is yes. The long answer has a little bit of context where it's hard to pin down what identity I most resonate with. For background, Emmanuel and Daniel, I was born in Uzbekistan, moved to the United States when I was 7 and 2 days old via the diversity immigrant visas, or the DV, as Emmanuel mentioned. And my heritage is Russian, right? So we can get into the complexity of what it's like to be a Russian person in the United States in 2023 when there's still a war going on. I feel semi-American because, yes, I've of course acclimated and assimilated to the American culture, but also, do I feel Russian? No. Do I feel American? No. So it's kind of that limbic or that limbo space in between. That's kind of what I'm bringing here today.
Okay, all right. And you mentioned a little bit about your upbringing as well. So from Uzbekistan, you came to Northern Virginia.
Yes,
is that right?
Yes, exactly. Like a lot of folks do. Like a lot of there's the central hubs. You've got the New York hub. You've got the DC hub. We happened to land in the nation's capital because my father happened to know somebody there. And then we moved to Arlington and then Fairfax, Virginia. So happened to really grow up in a privileged environment because like we all experience for high school, right? It's such an incredible educational system. Fairfax County is a great way or a great place for kids to grow up and have good education. And that was my parents' goal, right? As immigrants, how do we run away from the poverty, the sort of food lines, all of the detriment of living in an impoverished country to something that is full of opportunity, or quote unquote the American dream. So settled up in Nova, as we like to call it.
No, thank you for that. I think that really helps paint a picture of who you are, your background, your upbringing. And now you're based out of California, correct?
Yes. So I made the decision to move to Los Angeles about 4 years ago because I was so comfortable and so within community in Charlottesville, Virginia, where I was living and working, decided to take a leap of faith, a leap of, courage, because I didn't want to stagnate. Like I was so incredibly comfortable with my community. I had been working full time doing grad school up in DC, so commuting up and down from Charlottesville to DC. But loved Los Angeles because it was so dirty and grimy and challenging and beautiful and just full of everything, full of just like the hodgepodge, culturally, emotionally, spiritually, a lot of crystals here in Los Angeles. And decided to drive across the country because, when we're on our deathbeds and we're looking back on our lives, what are we going to regret not doing? That kind of fueled my decision to get out of my comfort zone, move into something very crunchy, very uncomfortable, and see how I landed. And luckily, it's been quite a ride so far. So happy to get into that later too.
Nice.
Perfect. Yeah, I definitely have a question or two regarding your drive. So you drove cross country?
Yes.
Okay.
All the way, 8 days.
Back to that.
Yeah.
Go back.
You kind of mentioned that story in your book. And speaking of, one of the first questions that we had while reading it is, how did you kind of come up with that title for your book, Joy in Plain Sight? It's something that, obviously reading your book, you kind of start understanding, where you're coming from and why you chose to title it. But for, some of us that might be interested in the book, could you tell us on how you came up with that title?
Of course. I'll make my way to how I came up with the title by way of inspiration for the book. So as we might remember, 3 years ago, right, this great big pandemic started and the world shut down. The world kind of really lost its color because people were dying. Millions of people were perishing because of COVID. And, similar to what y'all have probably have experienced, there was just an overload of work, of burnout, of just the emotional and mental toll of being a human in 2020. And unfortunately, not many of us could just move to a tropical island and, forget about our problems, forget about all of the problems that we might have had, as much as we might have wanted to. So I decided to think about what are the little things in my everyday that I can specifically tune my attention to, because I couldn't make any big changes, right? I was stuck in front of my computer working, 12 to 14 hour days, then trying to just emotionally cope with the world shutting down, the world, irreparably changing. And so I began taking myself out on these walks every single morning before work to see what are the little things that I could see right in front of me that were truly invisible until I paid attention to them. And little things that brought me joy, right? Why joy specifically? Because that's such a fundamental human emotion that we are probably very connected to as kids, right? I'd like for you to think back to y'all's childhoods. Maybe we can do a little bit of a thought experiment. Between the ages of 0 and 7 for y'all, or maybe between the ages of 0 and 10, was there an experience that stands out to you that brought just immeasurable joy or happiness or elation? Is there something that really jumps out at you in your memory?
It's probably the little things, such as, you kind of mentioned it in your book, experiencing nature, right? Experiencing things that you might not necessarily think about at the time, such as, for me, it was drinking water out of a hose after going out all day, playing in 100-degree heat, right, with your friends, and then just going to your friend's house and drinking water out of a hose and just appreciating the water, right, and the hydration, the cooling effect. That's actually a thought that I have a lot of times when I'm drinking water after I'm dehydrated. I'm ooh, this is that time when I was in elementary school, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Exactly. Back. So yeah, such a tiny thing, right? But that has such far-reaching impacts and consequences on your life today, 20, 30 years later. Emmanuel, is there an experience for you that kind of stands out in your mind?
One I think of is probably, I used to play a lot of soccer growing up. Mm-hmm. So we used to make teams, you're representing different countries and all this. And this was around the time of the 98 World Cup. So we were really feeling like we were representing an entire country. And it was a team of 2 or 3 people and just bragging rights and all that stuff. But we're so carefree. The biggest stressor was that. It wasn't, it was okay, what team should I be? And, are we going to win? And we were so carefree as children. So that's one of the biggest memories that I come back to.
Yeah. So it sounds like, again, the simple things, right? Drinking water from a hose, of getting that experience with your friends, of having such a core memory that it sounds like it brings about feelings of wonder, joy, awe, all of those fundamental feelings of oh shit, I get to be here, right? I get to experience this moment that makes sense in retrospect, right? That really just feels amplified. And that's why I wanted to call it joy in plain sight. It's those little ordinary things that really, at the end of the day, or when we reflect on it, make life feel extraordinary. Hence the title of the book, hence the sort of theme for the book of how do we point our attention to the little tiny things that really make life feel a little bit more magical than it might seem at the surface.
Is there a specific target audience that you wrote this book for?
Yeah, great question.
Audience in mind?
Yeah, that's a great question, Daniel. My publisher actually asked me that same question, Katya, narrow down your specific target audience. And it was really, really hard to do. But what I landed upon was anyone who feels mired in their work, who feels burned out, who feels overwhelmed by the sheer number of things that they have to do. And here's the reason why. One of the sort of key themes in the book is a lot of times we feel like human doings and not human beings, because we have so many things on our to-do list, right? Emmanuel, you're in residency, so your schedule is absolutely jam-packed. You just got home a couple of minutes ago, right? From a full day.
Yeah.
And how do we cultivate those moments to actually feel present versus feel like we're trying to get to the next thing? This is something that I still struggle with. Despite writing a book on joy, I'm well, dang, I don't feel very joyful because I'm also still working 15-hour days, right? So it's just this constant tension between human being and human doing. And so I really hope this book inspires folks who find themselves in spaces of like overwork, overwhelm, but also anyone who might want to feel a little bit less lonely in the world. And knowing that there's people who go through hard things. And I'm not saying I've solved it. I'm not saying I've overcome any of the hard things, but it's that continual process of like, how do we return our attention to the present moment? Because that's honestly all that we ever have. And it sounds a little, I hear myself saying this, I'm like, Katya, it sounds a little woo-woo there. But the reason that it works is because it does, right? When we are actually able to be so present, it paints a little bit of a more solid, more realistic picture of the world.
No, that's a beautiful take on it. So, you just mentioned our schedules, how it can be jam-packed and everything. And one thing I struggle with, I definitely overcommit myself to things. I can do it all, right? That's kind of the mindset I have. And then usually at the detriment of my own well-being, where I'm not getting enough rest, or, those feelings of burnout definitely creep through. Now, there's this kind of paradox, and we had this discussion as we were reading your book of how do I structure time? So there's, where the day's already structured, I have to do A, B, C, and D. Putting time for mindfulness also has to be structured, right? Mm-hmm. So it's this paradox of like, all right, I'm trying to get away from structure and do something for my own well-being. But then I also have to structure that into what I already have going on. How do we get around that? Or is that something that we have to just intentionally say, yes, it's part of the structure, but we still have to make time for ourselves?
Yeah, great question. Let me ask a follow-up question just to dig in a little bit deeper here. Emmanuel, do you feel like if you have to structure time for mindfulness, right, like a 5-minute meditation or whatever it might be, does it feel like another thing you have to do? Does it feel like an additional item on your plate?
It does before I do it. That would be my cop-out answer. But after the fact, every time I've done it, like every time, even if it's like exercise, I don't exercise nearly as much as Daniel, of course. But if I do some exercise and I hate it in the middle of it or beforehand, after the fact, I'm always like, I'm so glad I did that. I'm so glad I took some time to meditate or to go take a walk, or even if it feels like, do I even have enough time to do these things? I always feel better after the fact.
Yeah. So it's kind of, I struggle with this question because I vacillate between these two camps, which is one where we know the feeling, how good it feels after we do it, right? But before it feels like another item on our to-do list.
Right.
One school of thought is that of James Clear. He's a writer on habits, and I really love his books. I just read his latest book, Atomic Habits. It's been amazing. His whole sort of ethos is that we don't rise to the level of our goals. We fall to the level of our systems. And what that means to me is if we can structure our days into incorporating that 5-minute meditation, that, 10-minute walk, if we have that as a habit, right, versus something we do once in a while, then we feel better as a byproduct. So that's one of the schools of thought. It's the very structured one. My other school of thought is something that I most often experience, especially nowadays, because I do work a lot, is I don't have time for this, right? And so what happens then? Because it does feel heavy. Well, what happens then is how can we incorporate that sort of mindfulness into the things that we're already doing, like putting on scrubs, like changing from our work clothes to our workout clothes. I'm doing this really interesting group session right now. It's a coaching session on positive intelligence, the PQ, the positive quotient. And it talks about like anytime you go to the bathroom, right? Like even that like 1 minute of mindfulness of like, okay, I'm just going to be here to zen, to chill, to not think about anything. Incorporating that mindfulness into the daily habits that we already do. So we're habit stacking onto something that already exists. Do we do this perfectly? Absolutely not. Do I do this every day? Hell no. Right? But that intention to weave in that mindfulness, that presence into the things that we're already doing, that's something that I'm trying to work towards versus always having a 5-minute meditation on my calendar, despite the fact that my calendar is busy from like 7 a.m. to 11 p.m. Right. And I say this, I think back to our TJ days, our high school days, where we had competitions for who slept the least. Oh, you only slept 4 hours. I slept get out of here, right? Do y'all remember that? Like, was that a thing that you did with your friends?
Yeah, it's like a badge of honor.
Yeah, exactly, right? Whoever got the least amount of sleep. Yeah.
Exactly. And that sort of socialization, right? Like, it's something that we experienced in high school, probably in college, maybe in the corporate world, in the medical world. It's like that competition for like, who can suffer the most? Why?
Yeah.
Right? I asked myself that a lot. I was like, why am I trying to work so much if that's not the end goal? When we're on our deathbeds, we're not going to regret working, less. We're definitely probably going to want to have invested more in relationships and friendships and community. So that's kind of a roundabout answer, but curious how that lands for y'all.
Yeah. So, I mean, kind of going off of like what you just mentioned in terms of end goal, right? In your book, you mentioned that like to you, life has no inherent meaning. We exist, we die, and that's it, right? And you kind of talk about how you didn't necessarily grow up around religion, right? And that for you, we're basically reincarnated atoms that continue to go on and so on and so forth. Correct me if I'm wrong, right?
Mm-hmm.
But that's what I'm kind of paraphrasing, right?
Yeah.
So I guess if life has no inherent meaning, right? And are we just striving to do what just brings us happiness or joy? And how do we balance that in terms of responsibilities and obligations and doing things that might not necessarily bring us joy or happiness, things that we feel like we have to do, right? It's like that phrase of I work 5 days really hard so I can play for 2 days on the weekend, right? That type of mentality, right? Mm-hmm. Or I'm sacrificing like the next 30 years of my life working in this corporate hamster wheel, right? So that once I retire, I can have fun or relax, right?
Yeah, exactly. Daniel, that's a beautiful question. And it's, when you played it back, when you summarized it, I realized how bleak it sounds, right? We live, we die, that's it. Right. And I know that like that's a pretty nihilistic way to view life. Right. But I think that's actually a really beautiful way to live life. And I think that our religious ideologies are kind of opposite right now, which is why I love having this discussion. The reason that, so I'm not religious, but I am spiritual, right? So I think there is some sort of grander magic to the universe, whether it's God with a capital or lowercase g, whether it's whatever makes us feel connected to something bigger, right? Whether it's via the religious route, the spiritual route, the sort of like nihilistic route. Should we do things just to make us happy if life has no inherent meaning? Yes and no. One of the things that I've been really exploring lately is the lack of black and whiteness in questions like these. If we were to do things that make us happy, right? And if we were to do things that make our communities happy, can we ignore our responsibilities? Totally. We can absolutely ignore them. But then reality is going to slap us in the face with the consequences of ignoring those responsibilities, right? If we don't floss our teeth, if we don't brush our teeth, then yeah, we're going to have cavities and we're going to have to like replace our entire dental framework. So the question is less, to me, it sounds like the question is less around like, should we just maximize the good and minimize the bad, but rather about how do we balance and navigate both the good and bad stuff, because it's going to happen, right? Mm-hmm. We just experienced a pretty polemical and scary time in the history of the world, right? Like this era of the last 3 years and ongoing is going to be in textbooks, mm-hmm. but the way that it's going to be phrased is probably different based on who the publisher is, what political entities and influence the textbooks, right? How does that land? I'm curious. I'm just curious to hear from y'all's religious perspectives. Like, what is your take on life? How do you navigate the good, the bad, and the ugly in your views?
You want me to?
You take this one.
No, that's the answer. No, the way I see it, I try to focus on the things that I can change, like within my vicinity, like my sphere of my loved ones, friends, the whole nine, the people that I care about.
Yeah.
Are there ways that I can make their lives better? Are there ways that always striving to improve within myself too? I a lot of times the self-awareness and recognizing your flaws and whatever vision that you have of what is the best version of me and what do I need to do to get there. So I don't really, I used to be really upset. Like if you watch the news, for example, you'll see all the terrible things people are doing. And if that's the only snippet you have, then it is a really bleak outlook. Mm-hmm. And really one of the few things that we have in this life is hope, right? Yeah. That's really what keeps you going day to day. Mm-hmm. So that's how I view it, is let me just focus on what's close to me, and the world will play out the way it will play out.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know, I'm not by being anxious or stressing out about something, I'm probably not going to change it.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, what role does your religious beliefs play into that?
Oh, it plays a huge role. I think the biggest thing being, an Orthodox Christian is realizing your limitations. I think, and it's something that I realize even within my field, the limitations that we have, even as doctors. A lot of times we feel like, oh, we can fix anything, but that's not really the case. And I have a lot of conversations with, patients and their families where I'm quite honest with them. And I say, even we have our limitations, even with all this great technology that we have. And that my understanding is that, and that's why we're human. And that's why God is God. Mm-hmm. So that's kind of how I see it. Understanding like we really don't have a sense of control. Things will play out how they will. And you just do the best with what you can and what you experience.
Yeah. Yeah. It really sounds like you're kind of talking about what is our locus of control, right? Everything within this circle is things I can control. Everything outside of it, I just have to let go and surrender to it, right? Whether, in religious context or just like, I'm going to not think about it because I cannot influence it. There's no use in stressing or worrying. And yet we continue to stress and worry, right? Like that's the paradox that I think is so fascinating, is that we beat ourselves up, myself included, right? Of saying like, well, what if I did this? What if I do that? What if this doesn't work out? What if it does?
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Daniel, curious how like religion plays a role in the way in your worldview.
Well, I actually like that you mentioned locus of control, because for me, I think growing up from a religious background, there were two different phases that I saw in terms of the types of Christianity like that my family / like my parents went through. First was like more like evangelical, right? Where they're trying to tell everybody about God and whatnot, right? And then the other type where it's more like take care of the people around you, your family and friends. And then through that, maybe one person that you get close to or you become friends with, you are able to, tell about like God or religion and whatnot, right? So it's more so like kind of like that locus of control, right? Where you kind of control what you can control, right? And the people around you, versus trying to, do everything all at once, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah. I really like that. And I like that, the phrase of, it reminds me of the movie Everything Everywhere All at Once, which is an amazing film. For those listening, go watch it. Like it's really it's a transformational movie. Definitely made me cry. Of realizing that, like one of the biggest reckonings that I've had to grapple with, and I think both of y'all can relate, is knowing that not only can we not affect everything in other people's lives. I mean, it makes me think of your work, right? As a doctor, sometimes you can't save people, and people are going to die, right, in your care. And then knowing our own personal limitations of wanting to have, these extensive to-do lists, knowing that we'll only get to maybe 10, 20, 30% of them in a given day. I have this habit, I'll show y'all. I have this habit of writing these pretty large to-do lists for, a given week. So far, I've crossed off 2 things, and it's Tuesday, right? I mean, like luckily it's the week is young.
Yeah.
But it's balancing, just like telling ourselves, and this might feed in from our, TJs, our high school's perfectionistic mindset. Like we can do everything. We can have our cake and eat it too. In fact, I was challenged by someone recently that gave me that feedback. They're like, Katya, you are that person that wants to have her cake and eat it too. I'm like, well, absolutely. Like, I think anything's possible. Right. And they're like, but sometimes it's not. But I'm like, but sometimes it is. Like if you sleep hard enough, right? If you work hard enough, if you burn out where you're working 15-hour days, yeah, everything's possible. But at what cost?
Yeah.
What are the sacrifices that we're making? Like you said, in our mental health and our physical health.
Why do you think it is that, and I mean, this may not be the case for everybody, but a lot of times I find myself doing this where I extend a lot more grace to other people than I do to myself. And I don't know where that intrinsic property comes from, but it's something that I catch myself doing, and it's really hard to change. But I don't know if you've experienced that as well, because you just mentioned when you pulled out the notebook with the list of things that you wanted to do. I had that too. I mean, on my laptop, where I'm like, great, like I did one or two things and the week has gone by.
Right. And so why do we extend more grace to other folks versus ourselves? I think because a lot of times, because we live with ourselves, right? We are our own internal monologue and the monkey mind, the chatter. We don't see the full context of other people as fully as we see our own. So what I find is that most people, a lot of people tend to give, especially their friends, the benefit of the doubt, right? Like they might be going through a lot. They might be dealing with this or that. For ourselves, especially if we're self-critical or have a more preponderance to be self-critical, we're like, well, I didn't do this, then I must be, messed up, or I must be not good enough or not enough. I don't know. Why do y'all think we give ourselves less grace?
I don't know. Like, it's something that I've realized probably within the past year or so, because I feel like I'll excuse something if somebody's like having a bad day and they react in a negative manner, like it's a negative interaction or something. I'm usually like, oh, okay, something might have happened. Like, I won't take that personally. But if I were to do something like that, then I know I would be beating myself up over that. Like, days that where I'm like, why did I say that? Or why did I interact with that person in that way? So I don't know if it's just like holding yourself to a higher standard, but then it doesn't match up, So I don't have the answer. Just like you say in your book, like I don't have the answer, but hopefully we can get somewhere by discussing these things.
I think so. Can I add one more thing that might be a helpful little tidbit? Have y'all heard of the concept of the saboteurs, the things that sabotage us in our adult life? So this comes from research in a book by Shirzad. Oh my gosh, I don't remember his last name, but he wrote a book called Positive Intelligence, the sort of group that I'm part of. And it essentially goes through a list of the top 10 saboteurs that human beings have. These saboteurs are behaviors that we learned as children in order to protect ourselves from like childhood events or childhood trauma that now no longer serve us as adults. So one example of a saboteur is a people pleaser. If we had to grow up where our families might have been very, stringent, or they had high expectations of us, and the only way for us to get love was to please other people, then we're far more likely to be people pleasers in adulthood. My top 3 saboteurs, I'll name this, live on air. Hyperachiever. Like, to me, my self-worth is very much tied in to the things that I accomplish, right? Hence why I tend to be a human doing and trying to be less so. Also restless and stickler. So I really like plans. I love schedules. I love to do new things. But again, at what cost? Because I grew up in a very perfectionistic family and perfectionistic environment, these things are sabotaging the way that I show up to myself and others. And so, of course, like living with these saboteurs in our head, we're far more likely to judge ourselves, right? Versus knowing the saboteurs of other people. I'll send you all the link. And maybe if you want, you can add in the show notes of the saboteurs quiz, but it has been really, really transformational. I had my mom take it and, my friends take it, but something to think about of like, what is the chatter that our mind is producing that is tricking us into believing that we're not worthy or not whole?
Interesting. Yeah. No, thank you for sharing that. I'm definitely have to check that out. We should both.
Seriously. Another thing is, could you give us some tips or some ways that you personally might slow down and start to realize the small things around you that give you joy, and how you are more proactive about seeking these things within your daily life, so that, maybe some of our listeners and even ourselves, right, can start doing that and implementing it?
Yes, absolutely. I'd love to give 2 main ones and then see how we go from there. So the first is something that, again, habits researcher James Clear calls habit stacking. is if our goal, well, even before that is starting with the why, like, why do we want to become more happier? Why do we want to experience more joy? For me, it's because to me, joy is an antidote to burnout. Like if I'm tired of feeling crappy or tired all the time, then I want to feel its opposite, right? Enlivened, energized, galvanized. So first, step one is to recognize, like, why does this matter for you individually? Maybe it's to mitigate burnout. Maybe it's to feel more alive, whatever that is. Step two is to habit stack. And habit stacking essentially means trying to imbue a new habit onto something that already exists. One really nice way that I think a lot of us could maybe resonate with is hopefully we brush our teeth twice a day, right? So that's 4 minutes at least of us having that time to, have dental hygiene. During those 4 minutes a day, that is something that we can stack a joyful habit onto. What I like to do is I like to reflect on my day during those 4 minutes, morning and night, to say in the morning, like, what am I really excited for? Like running through a list in my head of like what I'm looking forward to, what I'm super jazzed about that day. And then at night, taking those 2 minutes to review, like, what are the concrete things that made me pause in wonder or awe or joy? So that's step one, to try to really like build on our habits. Step two is something that is a little bit more gamified, of intentionally seeking one tiny thing in the everyday that can make us pause and wonder. And the reason that's just one thing, not 5 or 10, is because the brain gets overloaded by having to do another thing on our list. So it's being mindful of, like, we step outside. What is just one thing that we can notice? Like actually training our brain and our focus muscle. The reason we choose just one thing is because otherwise, if we tell our brain to focus on 5 or 10 things, it can't focus on that. Our brain only is able to contain so many things at once. So stepping outside and deliberately looking for just one thing, stepping into the hospital saying, what one tiny little thing can I notice about this building, its people, its environment that makes me pause? Stepping, Daniel, into the corporate world, right? I used to work, and still do to a large extent, in corporate, right? Cubicle farm, especially when I first got out of college. I'm like, oh, this is not a great environment. And yet, what can I deliberately notice that is going to amplify my attention muscle to focus on that? So in summary, weaving in this joy habit onto something that already exists and gamifying it into just having like a little treasure hunt. What's just one thing every day that we can notice?
Katya, there's when you start off the book, you talk about a significant event that happened in your life, which was the car accident, right? And fortunately, both you and the other driver and all the passengers came out of it relatively unscathed.
Right.
Would you say that was like a big turning point in your life as far as your outlook? If you had like a timeline of your life, like that's like a big blimp where,
Yeah. Like a BC before car accident versus AC right after car accident. Again, this is a complex question to answer, and I've thought about this a lot of times before as well. I don't see my life as like, this is the chapter of Katya's life before, this is the chapter of Katya's life after. Because the meaning that I imbued into it only came later, right? What happened after the car accident is I went right back to working overtime, right? It was my 4th year of college, just continued working, 10 to 15 hour days, because I was like, I could not stop, could not get off the hamster wheel. But in retrospect, that near-death experience was something that made me realize, like, okay, well, that happened. That sucks. Glad everyone's okay. I'm actually going to that friend's wedding this summer, so it's an amazing sort of a sort of symphony of events. It's something that can, to some folks, be like that come to Jesus literally moment, right? Like, hey, life is actually precious. To me, it required a little bit more nudging to realize that, like, hey, life is actually freaking precious. Like, get off your hamster wheel, create these habits to be mindful, create these little micro opportunities to notice the things. But it's not something that I've reached. Like, none of this is, I don't come to y'all with the expertise or the answers to this, because I don't think any of us have them. It's a continuous journey of learning and relearning every single day. How do we stay present? How do we stay here?
Yeah. Wow.
Is that let me ask you this. Was that a satisfying answer? Because I don't feel like it is. Because there is no like, yes, of course. It was like
no, you answered it in the sense that you felt like, I mean, it was definitely a significant, but it doesn't define everything that you've done since.
Yeah.
That's how I took it.
Exactly.
Like that was
Same here.
Yeah. And I do want to, before I forget, I do want to ask that question about when you took that road trip from Virginia all the way to California.
Yeah.
What do you remember from that? Like, what are one or two experiences, interactions? Because I know you're a very interactive person with humans, right? And there's even a chapter where you talk about you're waving to people as they're driving by on the highway and such. Does anything stand out, or was there a realization that you came away when you were, when you finally arrived at your final destination, California, where you're like, wow, this is something that I didn't realize, but I do now?
Great question. I think the answer is twofold. And I think the answer paints what to me encompasses a lot of humanity, which is one, an appreciation of nature, and two, an appreciation of people. So let me talk about the nature part first. Because we made our way, my mom and I drove across the country, and she's just such a gem for, helping me move and then flying back out. Because we drove across the country, we naturally had to stop at the Grand Canyon. And I remember sitting there at sunset with this entire giant just crevice in the earth below us, right? Our feet were dangling by the railing, like off the edge. And it was so surreal. Just that feeling of awe and wonder, that like expansion, right? That starts from the chest, from the heart, and expands outward as the sun is setting, as the sky is turning like purple and mulberry and all these beautiful colors. Like that to me was a sublime moment. A lot of people who visit the Grand Canyon say similar things, right? Because just the sheer size of it is incredible. And just that reminder that there is the sublime, there is sublimation in nature. It makes us feel things that skyscrapers and that city streets don't. The reminder to seek those moments. Second was the connection to people. So we stopped at Boulder, Colorado, which is one of my favorite cities. We stopped at Boulder, Colorado on the way. Was lucky enough to stay with one of my good friends there, and I went on a hike. And the Colorado mountains are a little bit higher elevation than what we're used to here in California. So it's definitely like huffing and puffing up the mountain. And when I got there, I asked a couple of folks to snag me and my mom's picture because we made it to this hike. It was a really like cherished moment. What I found out is that those people were the advisors or the admissions committee to somebody I had met a couple of months prior back in Charlottesville before I moved. So me and that person had a really, really strong connection in Charlottesville. And I had to move a month or two after I met him. So, I said goodbye. I actually just connected with him a couple of months ago. And one of the girls was on the admissions or the interviewing committee for that person who just got admitted into business school, into grad school. And I was like, in what sort of an environment does this huge Venn diagram happen? And she knew him, and I called him. I was like, hey, like, guess who I just met? You'll never believe it. He's like, oh my God. I'm like, out of all places, smack dab in the middle of the country. Just that sheer serendipity, right? Like, how does that happen? And that's what I mean by like the magic in the universe. Whether, again, you're religious, whether you're not, it's seeking out those tiny memories, right? The ordinary moments that paint this beautiful color of life.
Wow. No, that's amazing. What a coincidence. Yeah.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah.
So another question that I had from your book is that, so you suggest there's perspective for everything, right? And that maybe that there's another side of the coin to any bad scenario, right? And that you might be able to switch up your mindset by choosing to do the things that make you happy. And you reference kind of like a scenario where you were looking out at waves and you felt that like the waves were kind of taking away your sadness, or like by changing your perspective and looking at your mirror and saying, hey, I am happy, right? And then those waves that were bringing in sadness turned into waves that were taking away sadness, right? So what if like in a scenario where like the pain or sadness is so overwhelming that it's actually like, for example, like an entire like tsunami or a hurricane that destroys a whole town or like your entire body? Like, what do you do in that scenario where you don't have maybe the luxury or the ability to even have any sort of happiness, right?
Yeah. Daniel, beautiful question. And I so appreciate that you asked it, because it's something that is really, really important to clarify. That I hope folks don't take away the toxic positivity sort of ethos of it, right? Like, yeah, things suck. Just think happy thoughts. If you're sad, just be happy. Simple solution to a simple question, right? What really resonates with me, and something that I have been coaching myself on as well as others, is to simply feel the feelings. When someone dies, when a tsunami, a hurricane, a tornado either hits a town physically or metaphorically, right? We just saw a bunch of tornadoes hit the Midwest. Like, that is horrifying, right?
Yeah.
Like tens of and maybe even hundreds of people are dead. Like, this is death we're talking about. This is the end of a human life. And that's really, really bad. And I'm not saying that we should say, yeah, well, humans die all the time, right? Because, I mean, yes, they do, but also it is really painful. It's really important to feel those feelings, because otherwise, if we don't go through the grieving process, then we're not able to heal or move on fully from that. I'm not saying, like, I just went through a pretty big grieving process myself, right? Like, I'll share this publicly on this podcast. The one of the people that I wrote about in this book, Nick, right? Like, he and I just broke up. So, like, all of this is full of love and adoration for this person whom is no longer my partner. And that sucks, right? That ended, and that hurt like hell. But do I find resonance and strength and, like, beauty and all of that? At the time, absolutely not. Right? Like, y'all, it hurt. It hurt like hell. And it hurt him. It hurt me. Like, there was a lot of pain. But having to go through that, like, knowing that the next day it might feel half a percentage point easier. The next day, maybe a full percentage point. The next day, maybe 2%. I don't want to give advice, because everyone's grieving journey is different, especially for horrific things like death or, huge natural disasters. Like, we saw the Turkey, Syria earthquake, right? Like, that is absolutely devastating. And I hope those people don't say, like, okay, well, my family's dead, but I can just survive, right? Because that's not how that works. It's acknowledging the fact that pain exists alongside with joy and happiness. It is not on opposite ends of the spectrum, but it is in the wheel of the human experience. As the wheel turns, right, we might revisit pain, we might revisit grief, we might revisit joy, and it's just going to come up over and over again. So, Daniel, back to your tsunami analogy, hopefully those tsunamis that metaphorically hit us feel a little bit less like tsunamis. Maybe they feel like big ass waves, and they feel like smaller waves, and they feel like tiny waves, and they feel like little laps of the ocean. And they may come back to tsunami level. Absolutely, right? Like, having a memory or remembering that the person that we love is not there anymore. But it's I just think that's part of the kaleidoscope of human experience. We have to feel all of the things to truly feel alive.
Yeah, this really just feels like we're catching up. Yeah. You know what I mean? Like,
yeah.
Not to minimize the fact that it wrote a book and it got published, and, it's being carried in stores and everything. But, man, like, a lot of growth over the past 12 years, 11 years, whatever, however long it's been. I obviously couldn't imagine us having a conversation like this in high school, but with time and experience, we've all grown and seen different things and faced different things. So,
Can I ask y'all a question?
Yeah, of course.
During the painful moments in your life, what has helped y'all kind of not necessarily get to the other side, if that's not the right semantics, but what helped you get through it, or at least feel a little bit less pained?
I think realizing that life will keep going on, right? And like you said, there is a circle, right? So at the end of the tunnel, right, you will start to feel happiness at some point, right? And kind of looking back after reading your book, I realized a lot of the things that you did write about were actions that I implemented without even knowing, right? Trying to look at small little things within my life that actually did bring joy, right? And I mean, obviously you can't necessarily say just be happy for people in like worse situations, right? But like, we had a conversation, for example, right? Like, what if you are in like a underdeveloped country, right? And you're a kid that is like starving, right? How do you tell them just be happy, just find joy, right? But, through having that conversation, we realized, they will have family, right?
Right.
And
they still like find ways to
small
silver linings,
silver
right?
linings,
They'll still, if they're kids and they're in a terrible situation, they will still probably find ways to interact with other kids, play games, to kind of take their minds off of things. So I mean, the way that I try to deal with like difficult moments, like you said, feel the emotions, and I think that's okay. Like if you're sad, allow yourself to feel sad. I try to limit, like I usually try to do like, all right, 24 hours of me feeling it, like woe is me, feeling bad for myself, and then kind of figuring out, all right, let me pick up the pieces and figure out a way to move forward. And that comes with reliance on faith. I pray a lot. That comes with reliance on family and friends, people that you trust, people that you can talk to. And anytime you talk to someone, it's trying to figure out, sometimes you just want to talk to somebody, right? To vent. And then other times you're actually seeking advice or guidance. But just trying to understand what your end goal is and having those conversations. That's kind of how I approach things when things don't go my way or something outside of my control happens.
Yeah. One of the things that y'all made me think about is the power of vulnerability, in that when we are grieving or when we are in times of pain, that can often be the times that we self-isolate, right? So we shut ourselves off from the world because like just things hurt, right? Brene Brown is a researcher on, emotions, and she has a bunch of books, a bunch of research about vulnerability, and she's like the queen of vulnerability as she's touted. But specifically reaching out to people when you least feel like it, when you feel like you're least, sexy, attractive, whole self. That's when it matters the most, because all three of us in this virtual space have experienced deep pain and deep grief. Can we confirm that? Like we have, right? Just as humans being alive for several decades, knowing that there's an almost 100% likelihood that every single person on this planet has experienced some degree of difficulty, and reaching out to other people is so incredibly necessary, right? Because the more that we're able to show up as our vulnerable selves, even with, Amanda, to your point, within that 24-hour grieving period, then moving on, or throughout a prolonged process of weeks and months and years even, right? Like realizing that we are not alone in this. That's part of why I wrote this. I wanted to kind of like reveal the warts of this ordinary person. Like I'm not some person on a pedestal or whatever. I'm just like an ordinary human being, just like us here, just like the folks who are tuning in. I just wanted to say like, yeah, life is so freaking messy and complex, and we are not alone in this experience together. The more that we can talk about these things and normalize pain and grief and joy and love and everything, the more that maybe that opens up folks to feel their own feelings and then bring their full selves into the mix.
And it's an interesting point you bring up, because the thing is, we've gotten older. I mean, Daniel and I have known each other since we were in high school, right? Since like the 10th grade. And you see so much more maturity and so much more, just with, we've both experienced things that aren't so great and things that are great. And we've seen each other at some of our lows. We've seen each other when things are going, very well and all that. And that's, it's a never ending process. Even in friendship, when you have those moments of vulnerability and you're sharing things. And I know that's a lot of times with guys, they don't really, open up or whatever the case is. But I think really I see him as like my brother, right? So a lot of things that I share with him, it requires, that's really the only way to really get to know someone, is to have vulnerability as part of, the friendship or that brotherhood, whatever the case is. It really allows you to gain perspective on why the other person's feeling a certain way and understand them better, so that you can be a better, brother or friend, or, son, whatever the relationship is.
It's right. It's combating that independence streak. Like I'm someone who's very independent, but I also know that like oftentimes there are so many beautiful, wonderful people in my life that are going to be there to pick me up and also celebrate the joys, right? So kind of being, the phrase through thick and thin, right? Having those close friendships, those close relationships. Research actually shows that think this is actually research from one of my favorite professors from UVA. Shout out to Dr. James Cohn, or Jimmy Cohn. He's the best. He is one of my favorite professors ever. I just gotta give that shout out. He's a social neurological researcher, and he explored the incidence of hand holding on stressful situations. So in, folks went into an fMRI machine. If you held hands with a stranger versus with a loved one, people in the stranger condition experienced more stress than people in the hand holding with a loved one situation when shown like a frightening image, right? So that physical touch, that closeness to someone whom you love or whom you're close to, really helps to attenuate or bring down stress, which is amazing because of that shared connection. So we need these social relationships in order to thrive. It's one of the core components to a long life and a healthy life.
Yeah. And this is, I think, one of the main reasons why we even started the podcast is in order to relate to others and have some sort of connection, even if, like a good portion of our listeners are actually international, whether it's in Europe or in Africa. And it's always it's fulfilling when we hear feedback from people, and it's people we either don't know or, we're like, wait, why someone in like Portugal listen to our to our podcast called Semi-Americans? But there are people everywhere that these are topics that we think are just necessary and just very important to have. And thank you for making the time in order to have such a wonderful discussion, catch up, whatever you want to call it. Yeah. Really, this has been so great, Katya, and congratulations on the book. Everyone who's listening, go put your order in right now as we speak, okay? Let's run the numbers up. All right. Let's make sure. Let's make sure to support one of our own. Katya, I want to open the floor to you if you have anything else that you wanted to share to the audience, to us, and then we'll wrap up.
I think that the last thing that I want to highlight is what I'm experiencing here, being a guest on your show, and also from the episodes that I've listened, is that what your podcast allows me to feel, and again, feel, right, versus to think. So I'm really getting into my heart here. Is to feel that we are so much more alike and connected than we are apart and disconnected. And I think that's what is being highlighted for me. Like, I see your backgrounds, right? You've got the Ethiopian flag, you've got the Korean flag, right? Did I get that right? Okay.
Yep.
And I've got, my plants in the background. That's my love all the plants here. But just that we're able to come together in these virtual spaces and interact with, hopefully some of the listeners. Like, y'all, this is part of that kaleidoscopic human experience. So thank you for creating that connection and the ability to recognize that we are so much more together than apart. So I'm just really, really supremely grateful for y'all.
Thank you for joining us, Katya. Seriously. We're going to need you to put the book up. We have the Kindle version, so it's not going to be as enticing. There you go. Join in plain sight. Yep. There we go. That's so great. All right. Like I said, everybody make sure to place your orders and support Katya. Thank you. Thank you to all our listeners. Another episode of the Semi-Americans podcast, season 3. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks so much, y'all. Have a great one.
Thank you.